Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Robert Buckland, the Government's Justice Secretary, formerly Solicitor General for England and Wales and Prisons Minister. Joining us down the line from Cardiff, Labour's Health Minister at the Senedd, previously the youngest ever President of the Welsh TUC, Vaughan Gething. Liz Saville-Roberts, elected as an MP in 2015, currently the leader of Plaid Cymru in the House of Commons. Rocco Forte, a hotelier with the business in his blood. He worked with his father at the start of his career and in 1996 started his own group of luxury hotels from Scotland to Shanghai. And prolific author, Professor of Creative Writing at Brunel University and joint winner of last year's Booker Prize for her novel Girl, Woman, Other, Bernardine Evaristo. Good evening. Welcome, of course, to my guests here in the studio, to Vaughan Gething joining us down the line, and, of course, to our audience, virtual audience. Thank you very much for being here. You are joining us from Cardiff and the Cardiff area. It's very lovely to have you with us. And, of course, if you want to join in the conversation, you can contact the programme at BBC Question Time on social media and be part of the conversation. So let's start with our first question tonight from our virtual audience, Tessa Marshall.
OK, so in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, will the panel commit to educating the citizens of the UK about the atrocities of the British Empire, take down the statues and the portraits that represent slave traders in the UK and people who profited from empire, really? And will you apologise for paying off the owners of slaves, a debt that the British people were paying off until as late as 2015?
Robert?
Well, I think we've got to confront our history, warts and all. And whilst there are many things we can be proud about with regard to Britain and its history, there's a lot that we need to confront and be honest about that is bad about our history. But I think that applying today's standards to what may have happened many hundreds of years ago is a difficult concept, to say the least. And I think rather than using the language of blame and apology, we should be being honest about it, being forthright about it, using democratic processes wherever possible to deal with it. So let's take, for example, particular statues to slave traders that might be in Bristol or elsewhere. Use the democratic process to, through a proper decision, decide what to do with that particular memorial or statue.
So do you think the people were wrong to tear it down, then?
I think they were. I think that whilst I absolutely get and understand the huge strength of feeling that's been engendered as a result of that appalling incident in Minneapolis, and the fact that many people have just had enough, and I get that utterly, I do think that we all owe it to each other to respect the rule of law and to, within that, work for greater equality. And I think the scenes that we saw in Bristol were disturbing in the sense that there didn't seem to be that sense of order.
I mean, your Justice Secretary, do you want to see those people prosecuted?
Well, I think an investigation is ongoing and we've got to let the police do their job independently and let the prosecuting authorities follow the evidence wherever it leads. But the point I'm making is that if we stand for something together and collectively in this great country, it's got to be the rule of law and those values of freedom that attracted so many people here in the first place and make this country, whilst it is imperfect and whilst there's a huge amount for us to do, a good place to live because we have that underpinning of the rule of law and democracy. Let's celebrate that, but let's be honest and confront the past as well.
And let me just... Tessa, when you said that you want the government to apologise for reparations paid to countries until 2015 for slavery, what are you referring to?
So, yeah, so the debt that was... that we were paying off refers to the £20 million that was paid off to slave owners when slavery became illegal in 1837. And so that debt is something that the British government was paying off until as late as 2015.
Robert?
Well, look, I think the history of our islands is always with us.
But were we paying off that debt until 2015?
I think, actually, the lady is right, because I've read reports similarly about that. But I think she makes a very powerful point about the fact that you cannot escape history, and I think it would be fundamentally dishonest of us to, through removing statues and airbrushing out history, to then pretend that all was well. Do you know, totalitarian regimes do that, and communist regimes and other extreme regimes do that sort of thing, and then pretend that all is well. No, we need to be honest, face up to it, and accept the fact we are as much prisoners of our history as anything else, but we have a chance through democracy to break free and progress.
Bernardine.
Yes, I totally disagree with you, actually, because I absolutely relish that statue being toppled, you know, in Bristol. They had tried for decades to either get the statue removed or to get a plaque put on the statue to provide the context for Colston's you know, history as a slave trader. And I think everybody now knows that he was culpable in terms of some 80,000 Africans being enslaved in the New World, and 20,000 of those Africans were also lost at sea. So I think he was a really toxic symbol in Bristol, and it was really important that he should go, or at least be contextualised, and people tried to do that, and they tried for decades. They didn't get anywhere with it. So it felt to me that it was totally right that they should topple that statue because of what he represented. And I'm totally for a lot of the other statues in this country being removed and perhaps recontextualised in museums or somewhere where we actually understand what role they played in society in a wider sense. And the whole idea about...
Which kind of statues, for example?
So there was somebody removed from outside the Museum of London, for example.
Yes, Robert Milligan.
There's also an argument, isn't there, about Lord Nelson, you know, who is such a sort of totemic figure, literally, in this country.
And would you want to see his statue come off?
Well, I think we need to have that
Nelson's
conversation, probably. But there is also this argument that's come up in terms of the statues that we can't change history and that it is the history of this country. But actually, history is a construction. OK, events happen, we have a past, and then historians contextualise that past and interrogate it. And what's happened in this country is that, you know, historically that has been done by white, elite white men who have been the historians, who have set the framework for the events of the past. So history is something that needs to be challenged and reinterrogated and revised constantly. And removing those statues is, in a sense, it's giving power to the people who really do object to a symbol of their historical slavery and all their allies as well. The other thing about history is that history has always excluded primarily women and people of colour and working class people and LGBTQ plus people in the ways in which it's been told. And that also goes to what you were saying about the colonial history. You know, a lot of people in this country don't understand the colonial history, or they understand it through a certain prism, where they feel that Britain went and travelled all over the world in order to help people. You know, there is still a section of society who don't think slavery was a really bad thing. So I think it's really important that we interrogate history. And when you have to take the law into your own hands and remove a statue, I mean, God, nobody died. You know, it's just this little tin statue, whatever it was, that was thrown into the river. And it then led to this conversation that we're having now about the rest of the relics of Britain's murky past. Then I think it's really important.
And when Tessa talks about removing statues or portraits of anyone who has profited from empire,
well,
I'm sort of wondering. I mean, that's where does that? Yes,
the country,
exactly.
Isn't it? But I think the visual symbols, the statues, are really toxic, and they really are an affront to our shared humanity. And I think at least we need to look at that. And you know, Britain was built on the wealth of slavery and colonialism. That's the truth. And we don't really admit that.
Rocco.
Well, there's a quote of Nelson Mandela's, says, "Hiding our history is not the route to enlightenment. We have to understand our history and we have to confront it." And I agree very much with what Robert Buckland was saying, that we can't judge the past by the values of today. And it seems that people are trying to use the evil of slavery to rewrite the history of this country. And and try and negate the heritage that this country has.
So do you think it was wrong to take down the statue of
yes,
Edward
well,
Cosson?
I think it's wrong to take it down in that way, and I think any vandalism of any kind is completely unacceptable. It's against the law, and it's disgraceful that the police, when they're not there in sufficient numbers, to prevent that happening.
I mean, people have made comparisons.
The worst aspect for me of the London demonstration, seeing police running away from demonstrators in fear. That's a breakdown of law and order, and it's mob rule, and it's completely unacceptable.
And when you talk about vandalism, for example, I mean, one example that's been quoted is, and I'm not equating the two, but the Berlin Wall, for example, which obviously people just pulled down themselves and the police stood by and just let it happen.
Well, I mean,
I'm not trying to say the two are the same, but nonetheless, it was
in any way comparable.
No, but the argument that is made is that it was something that people took upon themselves to do.
Statues of long forgotten people at a time when the country's sleepwalking to economic disaster, and our children have been prevented from going to school.
Well, we may well come to that, Rocco. We'll deal with one thing at a time.
No, it's mind-boggling.
OK, well, let's talk to some of our virtual audience who've got their hands up. Sim.
I think it's important that as a society we look at the past, but we don't need to glorify or celebrate the events of the past that we as a nation took part in. I agree that statues that have links to the past, so that bear issues relating to slavery, do need to be taken down. I'm not asking for them to be hidden. I think they need to be in a museum because museums are great places to educate and help remember the past. Maybe even have history about British colonialism or minority ethnic communities in the curriculum. I think that would be an important step that we could take as a society.
Fiona?
So I was just going to say, I agree completely with what Bernardine Evaristo said about the fact that in Bristol, I went to university in Bristol, and for years, it has been a topic of discussion to take it down. And, the voice is the whole democratic thing that we're saying is, well, people have been asking to take that down and people have been ignoring it. So in some way, somebody's been saying, well, no, actually, it needs to stay up there. So who were they trying to protect there? They're trying to protect the name of, they're trying to show that this statue should stay, and you say that it's disturbing the way it was taken down. If you think about the people that it's affected or the ancestors of the people that walk past it every day, would it not be disturbing to see someone glorified when they have killed thousands of people and are being sort of celebrated in a way so publicly? So I just don't agree exactly with what Rocco or what the Justice Secretary had to say there, that it's disturbing or that in some way it's anyway worse than going to the democratic way when there's still people trying to justify what that man did.
Elaine?
Hi. I like the idea of Tessa's second part of the question because there will be equal measures on both sides. I'm really interested in how we'll all come together and have a critical conversation about how we can go forward with this issue.
Well, let me come to John Williams on that. John, you wanted to take this question forward.
Yes. So will the possible taking down of 60 statues in the UK advance the cause of Black Lives Matter?
So, Vaughan, I mean, this just leads on really from Tessa's question, whether or not taking the statues down is productive, whether you approved of what happened in Bristol, and is it perhaps obscuring a larger or helping a larger discussion?
Well, I'm pleased that John's made his point in his question, because what I was going to say to the original question was that, yes, I do think some of those statues need to come down, and others that stay up, I think, need greater context about who those figures were. But the Black Lives Matter campaign is not a campaign to re-engineer our public space and remove statues. It's actually not even about the death of George Ford. It's about the persistent and continuing racial inequalities that affect not just America, but other countries around the world, including our own. And that's the point. And I think within that, this is only one small part of the debate we need to have as a group of countries, but then also the action that we need to take. And all of us are painfully familiar with the fact that criminal justice outcomes are different if you look like me compared to Robert. They're different in terms of what happens to you in terms of mental health services too. That's a sort of action that I think we need to see taken and not get too led down a blind alley here. And in doing that, it's not just examining our distant past, it's not even about trying to rewrite our history, it's understanding our history to help build our future. And the way politicians talk about this matters. So I think the Prime Minister would be in a better position to do his job if he recognised that at the start of the 21st century, talking about watermelon smiles and pickaninnies was not helpful. He was an MP at the time. The same for the leader of Plaid Cymru for some of the offensive comments he's made in the recent past too. We can all learn from this and take the opportunity of this extraordinary global movement to reset not just our view on our past, but much more importantly, to make changes to our shared future.
And Liz, obviously you want to respond to what Vaughan has said, but also just looking at John and Tessa's questions, they're, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. You know, should we be taking statues down, remove portraits, commemorating people who had profited from slavery or profited from the empire, Tessa's saying, or should we be? Is that in a sense counterproductive in terms of looking at the bigger issue?
I think certainly this is a time where, and I look back to the time when I was raised in Eltham and the terrible, appalling murder of Stephen Lawrence. And at that time, it drove many establishment changes, but it evidently did not drive enough. We know that. We know that we live in a racist society. Now, there's one thing that I just could refer back to what Vaughan said, and this is a little bit disappointing because, frankly, Vaughan, I think we are trying to fight from the same corner here. And you do know that Plaid Cymru, of course, Adam Price has called for an inquiry into structural racism in Wales. It was in response to his questioning that the First Minister of Wales responded with the concept, supporting the concept of a black and minority ethnic museum in Wales. And also it's been Plaid Cymru who's been leading on perhaps the major point, which is changes to the curriculum.
But what Vaughan's referring to is obviously Adam Price apologised for comparing Wales to a kind of colonial outpost.
Yeah, when we're looking at the real big issues of politics, one of the rather petty things that we do in politics in the United Kingdom is bring it down to personalities. And these are big, serious questions. Now, looking at the statues, and I raised this yesterday with the Prime Minister, of course, what we have within the United Kingdom is the way of presenting history very much through the eyes of the Conservatives. And the Prime Minister, when I asked him on this question, is that Conservatives don't pull down statues, Conservatives don't pull down statues. It was the imagery of the past. And yet, and I know that the Lord Chancellor will agree with this, we have much legislation in place to deal with racial hatred, but we know that we still live within a society which acts upon racialism and racism. So the question that I have for us now is how are we going to bring about the big social changes, the big changes in attitudes? That's why the statues are so interesting, because they are so symbolic of a certain sort of history that said the empire was fine, that the British Empire was a force for good and a force for good only in the world. This is not true. And now is the time to come to recognise that it isn't just the history of powerful white men who often made their money and their fortunes out of the sufferings of others. Now is the time for the voice of the others to come through. And that is my hope for the future. But the fact that we're having this discussion here, it has to go beyond the usual talking heads of politicians and get into our curriculum and really change people's attitudes.
OK. Taya?
Slavery has bred racism. As a person in a responsible position, I can't even bring myself to repeat what some politicians, including our Prime Minister, has said in the past about ethnic minorities. I've been reading history at AS level, revising with my son who didn't do his proper exam, but I've read about Pit to Peel. The curriculum needs to change. The War of Independence is depicted as the Indian Mutiny. That needs to change, especially children who are born and bred over here. My son considers himself as Welsh. And for him to read history in a different manner than what I have read and what I've read recently, I think it's important that violence should be condemned, but racism from top down needs to be dealt with. I'm very proud to live in Cardiff and work in Cardiff for the last 25 years. It's a multicultural society, but we need to make sure that from top down, from Boris downwards, we need to deal with this racism.
Robert, I mean, we heard the Prime Minister talk about this at Prime Minister's Questions yesterday. The comment he made about Piccaninnies waving at the Queen and watermelon spies has come back time and time again to haunt him. What are we going to see from the government, if anything?
You know, a Prime Minister who was mayor of probably the most cosmopolitan city in the world and was elected twice, and whose approach to issues of migration and multiculturalism has been open, liberal and inclusive. And his remarks in the aftermath of the unlawful killing of George Floyd, I think, were appropriate. They struck the right tone, and he talked in a positive way about what needed to be done. So I think absolutely we have the right approach. I think that sense of trying to bring people together is what we need now. And I think a lot of the remarks, I think, are on the money when it comes to the fact that rather than focusing upon icons and statues, actions speak far louder than words. And Vaughan has made the point about the criminal justice system. I have responsibility for that in England and Wales. I absolutely take responsibility for the need to improve the way in which we deal with black and minority ethnic people in that system. And there's a whole range of things that we are doing. No time to go into them now, but the sort of practical measures that we've got to do to make the experience different.
One specific question there, please. The black population in Wales is overrepresented by 5 times within the prison population of Wales. Surely that is a desperate failure. That is an indication of the racism of our society in action. Would you, as the Secretary of State for Justice, commit to using that as a target to reduce that percentage, that unacceptable percentage within the prison population, specifically in Wales? But of course it applies throughout England and Wales entirely.
Well, what I commit to, Liz, is making sure that the problems that are inherited by the criminal justice system are dealt with further up the line, and the diversions that are needed in order to help people of that background not to get into the system in the first place are what we're going to have to do. And that's not just me, that's education, that's health, that's housing. That's the whole apparatus of government in Wales and in Westminster actually coming together round the problem and the individual, rather than this silo approach that means that I end up being responsible for a system with a disproportionate number of young people from that background within it.
Bernardine, I just think that mealy-mouthed refusal to engage in the reality that the Prime Minister said something deeply offensive at the start of the 21st century, it is a real issue. For people that look like me, having a Prime Minister who used the language like watermelon smiles and piccaninnies, it matters. Just as someone comparing the experience of Wales to colonialism and the African-American experience, it matters and it's offensive. And if we want to move on, we've got to accept that that isn't acceptable. And you gain credit for yourselves and your parties, and actually the healing that I want to see take place right across the United Kingdom, if you only acknowledge what is staring you in the face. Because it isn't just the fact that I'm a politician, I'm this colour every day of the week, every single day of the year. And it matters to me that we are spoken about and treated in a way that reflects who we are and not the colour of our skin. So use language that matters and make sure you're not making these mealy-mouthed apologies for things that are plainly wrong.
I think that, you know, I found Boris offensive all along with his journalism in The Spectator, with the racist things that he said. When he became mayor of London, yes, he became mayor of an incredibly multicultural city, but one of the first things he tried to do was to get rid of Black History Month. Right? So we're talking here about the importance of history and acknowledging the past, and also we should be celebrating the entire population, people of colour, and our contribution to this society. We've been here since the Romans. It's something I've written about. And we have a mayor who tries to get rid of the single thing that we do to bring to the wider public the fact that we have a history. And in fact, the truth is, of course, black history is British history. This is a multicultural country and it always has been. And British history is world history because we had an empire that ruled over a quarter of the world for a very long time. So I really don't accept you apologising or trying to, you know, to present Boris Johnson in a good light, because I found him deeply offensive.
Robert, do you want to respond? I'm going to move on in a minute. Do you want to respond to that? This is the Prime Minister, after all. Look, this is the leader of your party.
I would say that journalists write lots of things and write lots of polemic and lots of things that they would later not come to regret and not choose to do. No. I would say this, that...
Has the Prime Minister ever said that he regretted using those terms?
Look, I can't speak for him about what might have been written 15 or so years ago. I've got to judge the person on his actions as an elected politician. And what I've seen is somebody who absolutely understands the challenges we face, accepts them, faces up to them, and wants to do something about them.